I should have known something was wrong when the pay was that good. $3,000 for a single run up the Yukon Territory's ice roads. That's more than I'd made in the past 2 months combined. But when you're 3 payments behind on your rig and living off gas station coffee and day-old sandwiches, you don't ask too many questions about generous contracts. The logistics company was called Northern Freight Solutions, though their office was just a prefab trailer behind a truck stop in Whitehorse. No website, no online presence I could find. Just a phone number that connected me to a gravelly voice that promised cash. Payment on delivery. I met Roy Hendricks at the way station on a Tuesday morning that felt colder than the surface of Mars. He was maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of diesel fumes and highway wind. When he handed me the freight manifest, it came with a stapled packet of papers. Safety instructions, he said, his breath forming clouds in the -30 air. Read them. Follow them. Don't be creative. I flipped through the packet expecting the usual: speed limits, chain requirements, radio protocols. Instead, mixed between legitimate safety warnings about black ice and brake fade, I found a handwritten list that made me chuckle. Do not stop for hitchhikers, no matter how desperate they look. If you hear knocking from inside your trailer, do not open it. Always honk twice when passing mile marker. Turn 9, never drive past midnight. On the ice roads, do not respond to CB calls from drivers you haven't physically seen. The list went on for 2 pages, each rule more bizarre than the last. I looked up at Roy, expecting to see the hint of a smile, the telltale sign of an elaborate hazing ritual for the new guy. Instead, his expression was stone serious. Trucker folklore? I asked. Roy's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Fear, maybe, or the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from seeing too much. Son, he said, zipping up his parka, folklore is stories people tell around campfires. These are instructions for staying alive. He walked away without another word, leaving me standing in the snow with my manifest and my doubts. I climbed into my cab, a 2018 Peterbilt that had seen better years, and started the engine. The heater wheezed to life, fighting against the Arctic air seeping through every seal and gasket. As I pulled out onto Highway 5, heading north into the endless white expanse of the Yukon Territory, I told myself the rules were nonsense. Superstitions born from too many long nights on empty roads, shared and embellished until they took on the weight of gospel. The silence of the road pressed against my windows like a living thing. No other traffic, no signs of civilization beyond the narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the snow-laden forest. Just me, my truck, and 800 miles of frozen wilderness. I should have taken the rules more seriously. 4 hours into the drive, the monotony was starting to get to me. The landscape was hypnotic. Endless ranks of snow-heavy spruce trees, broken occasionally by frozen lakes that stretched to the horizon like sheets of hammered steel. My CB radio crackled with static, picking up nothing but empty frequencies. That's when I saw the hitchhiker. He appeared around a bend like something out of a nightmare, standing dead center in my lane about 200 yards ahead. Even at distance, I could see he was waving frantically, his movements jerky and desperate. My foot moved instinctively toward the brake pedal. In weather like this, exposure meant death in minutes. The wind chill had to be pushing 60 below. Whatever had stranded this guy out here, broken down car, snowmobile accident, sheer bad luck, he needed help. And I was probably the only person who'd come down this road for hours. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The man was wearing a heavy parka, but it hung loose on his frame like he was made of sticks. His hood was up, shadowing his face, but his posture was all wrong, too rigid. Like a mannequin posed by someone who'd never seen a human being stand naturally. Do not stop for hitchhikers, no matter how desperate they look. Roy's voice echoed in my memory, along with that look in his eyes. I eased off the brake, maintaining speed, telling myself I'd radio for help once I had cell coverage. The hitchhiker turned toward my truck as I approached. For a split second, the shadow of his hood fell away, and I saw his face. His skin was the blue-white color of old ice, and his smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a rictus grin that no living person could manage. But it was his eyes that made my blood freeze. They were completely black, like holes punched through reality itself. I stomped on the accelerator, my Detroit engine roaring as I blew past him at 70 miles per hour. In my side mirror, I watched him shrink into the distance, still standing in the middle of the road, still waving. Then I looked again, and the road was empty. I pulled over a mile later, hands shaking as I tried to light a cigarette. The flame from my lighter danced wildly in my trembling fingers. I told myself it was the cold, the isolation. Maybe carbon monoxide from a faulty exhaust system playing tricks with my brain. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I dug the safety packet out of my glove compartment and read the first rule again. In the margin, someone had written in faded pencil, "They're always hungry." The handwriting was small, cramped, like it had been scrawled in a hurry or in the dark. Below it, barely legible, were the initials DK. I sat there for 10 minutes, engine idling, heat blasting, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced had a rational explanation. When that failed, I tried to convince myself that following a list of crazy rules was somehow less crazy than what I'd just witnessed. Neither argument was particularly compelling. I put the packet away, checked my mirrors one more time, and pulled back onto the highway. The rules didn't feel like superstition anymore. They felt like the difference between getting home alive and becoming another story whispered in truck stop diners. Mile marker 209 was still 6 hours away. The Frontier fuel stop appeared out of the snow like a mirage, a cluster of buildings around a pair of diesel pumps, surrounded by the kind of security lighting that turns night into an artificial orange-tinged day. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, and my nerves were stretched tight as piano wire. That's where I met Cal Morrison. He was maybe 25, with the kind of swagger that comes from being young and stupid enough to think the world owes you something. His rig was a brand new Kenworth, all chrome and LED lights. The kind of truck that screamed daddy's money to anyone who'd spent real time on the road. "You the other guy running freight for Northern?" he asked, approaching me at the fuel island. His voice had that particular brand of confidence that made me want to punch him in the throat. "Ethan Miles," I said. Extending a hand, he shook like he was trying to prove something. "Cal Morrison. Just started this route last week. Easiest money I've ever made." He laughed, a sound that seemed too loud in the Arctic stillness. "You get the crazy rules packet too?" I nodded, still tasting the memory of the hitchhiker's impossible smile. Bunch of bullshit, right? Some old-timer's idea of a joke. Don't stop for hitchhikers, honk at empty signs, don't open your trailer. Like we're running through some Stephen King novel. He shook his head, still grinning. "I've been ignoring all that crap. Nothing's happened yet. Something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in my stomach. Maybe you should take them seriously." Cal's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "Come on, man. You really think there's some supernatural boogeyman out here policing truck drivers? It's the middle of nowhere, not the middle of a horror movie." We headed out together in convoy, maintaining radio contact. Cal kept up a steady stream of chatter. Complaints about dispatch, stories about bars in Calgary, theories about which rules were the most ridiculous. I let him talk, focusing on the road and trying to ignore the growing sense that we were being watched. Mile marker 209 appeared in my headlights like a tombstone. Always honk twice when passing mile marker 209. I slowed down, reached for my horn and gave 2 sharp blasts. The sound echoed off the surrounding forest, seeming to linger longer than it should have. What the hell was that for? Cal's voice crackled over the CB. "Mile marker 209, I said. "The rules—" "Oh, for Christ's sake!" His transmission cut off for a moment, then returned with that same dismissive laugh. "I'm not honking at an empty sign in the middle of nowhere. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." His truck rolled past the marker without ceremony, headlights disappearing around a bend ahead of me. For a moment the radio was quiet except for the soft hiss of static. Then Cal's voice cut through, but it wasn't the cocky, dismissive tone from before. It was high and tight with panic. "What the— Something's on my truck. Something's on my fucking truck." Through the windshield, I could see his brake lights flaring as his rig swerved wildly across both lanes. The trailer fishtailed, nearly jackknifing before he managed to correct it. "Cal, what's happening?" "There's something— Oh God, it's got arms like— It's moving toward the cab." In the distance, I could just make out a dark shape clinging to the side of his trailer, too large and moving in ways that hurt to look at. It seemed to flow rather than climb, defying every law of physics I thought I understood. Cal's truck straightened out, and for a moment everything seemed normal. Then the thing, whatever it was, slipped away into the tree line with a fluid grace that made my skin crawl. "Cal, you okay?" "Silence, Cal." "Yeah, I'm—" I'm here. His voice was different now, smaller, like a child afraid of the dark. Must have been shadow from my headlights. Tree branch or something. But I'd seen it too, and it wasn't a shadow. It was something that shouldn't exist. Something that the rules warned about for very good reasons. We met up at the next fuel stop an hour later. Cal's hands shook as he filled his tank, and his eyes kept darting to the tree line, like he expected something to come shambling out of the darkness. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone whose worldview had just been shattered with a sledgehammer. "You didn't see anything back there," he said. Not quite a question. I could have lied, could have let him maintain the comfortable fiction that what happened was explainable. Instead, I pulled out my packet of rules and showed him the margin notes. "DK wrote these," I said. "Roy mentioned him. Said he didn't make it through last winter." Cal stared at the cramped handwriting, and I watched the last of his skepticism crumble like ice in a spring thaw. The road wasn't just dangerous, it was malevolent. And we were driving through its territory by sufferance, protected only by a list of rules that seemed insane until you needed them. "Fuck," he whispered, and the word hung in the air like a prayer. I couldn't sleep that night. We'd pulled into a rest area 50 miles past the marker, our rigs parked side by side under sickly yellow sodium lights that made everything look diseased. Cal had retreated to his cab without another word, and I could see him through his windshield, staring at his own copy of the rules like they were written in hieroglyphs. I sat in my bunk, studying the packet by the light of my reading lamp. The official safety warnings were printed on standard dot letterhead, but the additional rules had been added by hand in different inks, suggesting they'd accumulated over time. Some were written in steady block letters, others in hurried scrawl. A few looked like they'd been added with whatever writing implement was handy: pencil, ballpoint pen, even what might have been crayon. The initials DK appeared throughout the margins, sometimes accompanied by dates from the previous winter. December 15th, saw 3 of them at once near Beaver Creek. January 8th, radio picked up signals from 1987 trucker accident. Don't respond. February 2nd, they know our names. The entries painted a picture of someone slowly losing their grip on reality, or documenting encounters with something that shouldn't exist. The final entry was dated February 14th. If you find this, follow the rules. They're all that's left of me now. I had to know more. The next morning, I radioed ahead to the way station and asked Roy about DK. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the connection had failed. "Danny Kowalski," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good driver, 20 years experience. Found his truck in a ravine last spring, wrapped around a pine tree. Never found Danny. What happened?" Another long pause. "Coroner said he'd been out of the cab for hours before the crash. Footprints led away from the wreck and just stopped. Middle of a snowfield. No place to go, but the prints just ended. The line went dead. That afternoon, pulling into an abandoned rest area to check my load straps, I found something that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. Behind a broken vending machine, wedged into the gap between the machine and the wall, was a small notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. The cover was warped from moisture, but I could still make out DK written in black marker, Danny Kowalski's journal. I sat in my cab and read it by fading daylight, and with each page the world became a colder, more hostile place. The entries started normal enough: delivery schedules, fuel costs, complaints about dispatch. But as winter deepened, they took on a different tone. November 18th, saw headlights in my mirrors for 3 hours straight. When I pulled over to check, nothing there. Road behind me was empty for miles. December 3rd, radio's been picking up chatter from drivers who died years ago. Recognized Pete Carlson's voice. He went off the road in '92. He was asking about road conditions ahead. December 20th. Something's been knocking from inside my trailer every night. Company says it's cargo shifting, but I hauled the same load of machine parts for 5 years. They never knocked back then. January 15th. The hitchhikers are getting bolder. Saw one today that looked like my ex-wife. She's been dead for 10 years. The entries became more frantic, the handwriting looser and more hurried. Danny had started marking rule violations he witnessed other drivers commit, documenting the consequences with clinical precision. A driver who'd responded to phantom CB calls found his truck surrounded by figures that shouldn't exist. Another who'd driven past midnight discovered he'd somehow lost 6 hours and 200 miles with no memory of the journey. The final entry was dated 3 days before. Roy said they'd found Danny's truck. February 11th. They're not just testing us anymore, they're learning. Copying voices, mimicking faces, getting better at passing for human. The rules are all that keep them at bay, but I don't think they're enough anymore. They're evolving, and we're running out of ways to hide. If someone finds this journal, know that the ice roads aren't just dangerous, they're infected. Something's been feeding on the isolation and fear of drivers for decades, growing stronger, hungrier. The rules buy you time, but time's running out. I can hear them outside my cab right now, calling my name in my mother's voice. I know it's not her, she died when I was 12, but God help me, I want to answer, that was it. The journal ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that I was in way over my head. I slept that night with my doors locked and my CB turned off, but sleep brought no peace. I dreamed of footprints in the snow that led nowhere, of voices calling from empty air, of things that wore familiar faces like masks. When I woke at dawn, there were footprints circling my truck in the fresh snow. Barefoot prints, despite the fact that the temperature gauge on my dashboard read 43 below zero. I followed them with my eyes, noting how they approached from the tree line, circled my rig 3 times, then headed back into the forest. At the edge of the clearing, they simply stopped, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air, or had never been there at all. I started my engine and got back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been studying me while I slept, taking my measure, deciding whether I was worth the effort of hunting. The rules weren't just guidelines anymore, they were a lifeline, and I was beginning to understand that some lifelines were meant to be permanent. The Northlands Diner sat at the intersection of 2 ice roads like a ship run aground on a frozen sea. It was the kind of place that existed purely out of necessity, a refuge for drivers who needed hot coffee, and human contact after too many hours alone with their thoughts and the endless white expanse of the Yukon. I pulled into the parking lot 3 days after finding Danny's journal, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. Cal had been radio silent for the past 100 miles, and when I'd tried to raise him on the CB, all I got was static and what might have been whispers in a language I didn't recognize. Inside, the diner was exactly what I'd expected. Red vinyl booths with tiers held together by duct tape, fluorescent lights that flickered with electrical arthritis, and the smell of coffee that had been cooking since the Cretaceous period. A handful of other drivers occupied scattered tables, all of them with the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much and slept too little. That's where I met Mara Sinclair. She was maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades gripping steering wheels. She sat alone in a corner booth, studying a map spread across the table like a battle plan. When she looked up and caught my eye, I saw recognition there, not of me personally, but of what I was, another driver running the ice roads, another soul trying to navigate territory that didn't play by normal rules. "You're new," she said as I approached. It wasn't a question. "Ethan Miles," I said, extending a hand she shook with surprising strength. "How'd you know?" "You still look surprised to be alive." She gestured to the seat across from her. "Mind if I ask which route you're running?" I told her about Northern Freight Solutions, about the rules packet, about everything I'd seen and found. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I mentioned Danny Kowalski's journal, she closed her eyes and shook her head. "Danny was a good man," she said finally. "Been driving these roads for 15 years. Knew every trick, followed every rule. If they got to him..." She let the sentence hang unfinished. "They?" I asked. Mara looked around the diner, making sure no one was listening, then leaned forward and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "They ride the ice," she said. "Been out here longer than the roads, longer than the trees. Some say they're spirits of people who died in the cold. Others think they're something that was here before humans ever set foot in the territory. Doesn't matter what they are. What matters is what they want, which is to not be alone anymore." Her eyes met mine, and I saw decades of accumulated fear there. They watch the lonely roads, looking for drivers who've lost their way. They test you, push at the boundaries, see if you'll break the patterns that keep you safe. Each rule you follow is a barrier between you and them. Each rule you break is an invitation. She reached into her coat and pulled out a cracked photograph, the kind with white borders that went out of style in the 80s. It showed a group of maybe 8 truckers standing in front of their rigs, all smiles and confident poses. But several of the faces had been scratched out with what looked like a key or nail, leaving gouges in the photo paper. 20 years ago, Mara said, tracing the damaged faces with a finger. Every one of them thought they knew better than the rules. Every one of them thought they could outsmart whatever was out there. What happened to them? They broke the patterns, stopped for hitchhikers, opened their trailers when they heard knocking, drove past midnight when they should have pulled over. One by one they disappeared. Sometimes we'd find their trucks, sometimes not. But we never found the drivers. I studied the photo, noting how the scratched-out faces seemed to stare back at me through the damage. Why are you telling me this? Mara folded the photo and put it away. Because you're still new enough to listen. Some drivers, they get out here and decide the rules don't apply to them. They're special. They're smart. They can handle whatever the road throws at them. Those drivers don't last long. She stood up, leaving a $5 bill on the table next to her untouched coffee. The rules aren't suggestions, Ethan. They're survival instructions written in other people's blood. Follow them and you might make it home. Break them and you become part of the ice. Wait, I called as she headed for the door. How long have you been running these roads? She paused, not turning around. 23 years come spring. If I make it that long. How many rules have you broken? None, she said, and walked out into the snow. I sat there for another hour, staring at my own reflection in the coffee cup and thinking about patterns and boundaries and the price of being alone. When I finally got back to my truck, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper, written in the same shaky handwriting from Danny's journal. The rules evolve. New ones appear when needed. Trust them even when they don't make sense. Especially then. I looked around the parking lot, but saw only empty snow and the distant glow of my fellow drivers' running lights. Whoever had left the note was long gone, swallowed by the endless white expanse of the territory. But as I climbed into my cab and started the engine, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name from the direction of the forest. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it, like someone I'd known long ago, calling to me from across a great distance. I turned up my radio and pulled back onto the road, trying not to think about how many drivers had heard similar voices over the years, or what had happened to the ones who'd been foolish enough to answer. It was past 11 when the CB crackled to life. I'd made good time despite the weather, pushing through a snowstorm that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. The road was a tunnel of swirling white in my headlights, and I was fighting the urge to pull over until morning. One of the rules was clear: never drive past midnight on the ice roads. But I was still an hour from the nearest truck stop, and the thought of spending the night parked on the shoulder in this weather made my skin crawl. That's when I heard the voice. Help me. Please, it's so cold. The transmission was weak, full of static, but unmistakably the voice of a child. Maybe 8 or 9 years old, terrified and desperate. My heart clenched as I grabbed the mic. This is Unit 447, I copy. What's your location? I don't know. We went off the road. Mommy won't wake up. I felt sick. A car accident in weather like this was essentially a death sentence, especially with a child involved. I started scanning the roadside for any sign of wreckage, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where they'd gone off the road. Stay calm, sweetheart. I'm going to find you. Keep talking so I can track your signal. But the next voice that came through the radio wasn't the child's. It was Cal's, and he sounded more scared than I'd ever heard another human being sound. Ethan, don't respond to that transmission. It's not real. What? Cal, there's a kid out here. It's not fucking real. His voice was raw, desperate. I've been hearing it for the past hour. Same voice, same words over and over. I stopped to look for them. Earth and I stopped and went into the woods, and there's nothing there. Nothing but footprints that don't make sense and trees that whisper when there's no wind. My blood turned to ice water. I remembered Danny's journal, the entry about voices calling from empty air, about things that learn to mimic human speech. Do not respond to CB calls from drivers you haven't physically seen. The child's voice came through again, closer, somehow more urgent. Please, mister. I can see your lights. We're down in the ditch by the big pine tree. I slowed the truck, peering through the snow at the roadside. There, about 100 yards ahead, a pine tree larger than the others. and what might have been tire tracks leading into the ditch beside it. My training warred with my conscience. Everything I'd learned about being human screamed at me to stop, to help, to do whatever it took to save a child's life. But everything I'd learned about the ice roads whispered that this was exactly what they wanted, for me to break the pattern, to step outside the protection of the rules. I was still wrestling with the decision when headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, approaching fast. Too fast for the conditions. As the vehicle got closer, I could see it was a pickup truck weaving erratically across both lanes. The driver was leaning out the window, waving frantically for help. I could see his face clearly now, young, maybe 25, with frost covering his eyebrows and ice crystals in his hair. His lips were blue with cold, and his movements had the jerky desperation of someone in the final stages of hypothermia. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop. This wasn't some phantom transmission or shadow in the trees. This was a real person in real danger, and I might be his only chance of survival. But as I watched him in my mirror, something changed. For just a split second, the desperate expression slipped from his face like a mask falling away. Underneath was something else, the same too-wide smile I'd seen on the hitchhiker days ago, the same black eyes that reflected my headlights like pools of oil. The pickup truck veered suddenly toward the ditch, moving with inhuman precision. Instead of crashing, it seemed to melt into the snowbank and disappear without a sound, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The CB crackled again. "Mister, please." It's getting darker, but now I could hear it, the artificial quality to the voice like a recording played through damaged speakers. It wasn't a child. It had never been a child. "Cal," I transmitted, my voice shaking. "You still there?" Silence. "Cal!" More silence, then a burst of static that might have been a scream cut off mid-breath. I drove for another hour without seeing another vehicle, living or otherwise. The child's voice continued to plead from my radio until I finally turned it off, unable to stand the sound of manufactured desperation any longer. At 11:47 p.m., I pulled into a truck stop and parked between two other rigs. I sat in my cab with the engine running, heat blasting, trying to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation, atmospheric interference maybe, or some kind of elaborate prank. But the part of me that had been driving the ice roads was learning to trust a different kind of logic. I turned my CB back on and tried to raise Cal one more time. The radio hissed with empty static for a long moment, then a voice came through, Cal's voice, calm and conversational. "Hey, Ethan, everything's good out here. Just pulled over for some rest. See you at the next fuel stop." But it wasn't Cal. The words were right, the voice was identical, but there was something fundamentally wrong with the rhythm, the inflection. It sounded like someone doing an impression of Cal based on a description they'd heard secondhand. "Cal, what's your location?" "Oh, you know, the usual spot. Hey, remember that thing we talked about? About the rules being stupid? So I think you were right. We should meet up and compare notes." I turned off the radio and sat in the growing silence, understanding with crystal clarity that I was alone out here in ways I'd never imagined. The things that rode the ice weren't just hunting, they were learning, adapting, becoming better at passing for human with each encounter. And somewhere out in the snow, the real Cal Morrison was either dead or something worse. I checked my locks twice before trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, the wind against my cab, the settling of my trailer, the distant hum of other drivers' generators, seemed like something trying to get in. The rules weren't just about survival anymore. They were about staying human in a place where humanity itself was under siege. I should have turned around at first light. Instead, I pressed on toward my delivery point, telling myself that completing the run was the only way out of this nightmare. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of Arctic brightness that makes everything look sharp-edged and hostile. I'd been driving for 2 hours without seeing another vehicle when I heard the first knock. It came from inside my trailer, a single deliberate rap against the interior wall. I told myself it was cargo shifting, maybe ice forming and falling from the ceiling. But then it came again and again, settling into a steady rhythm, like someone tapping out Morse code. If you hear knocking from inside your trailer, do not open it. The rule was clear. But the knocking was getting louder, more insistent. What if something had gotten into my trailer back at the fuel stop? What if there really was someone trapped inside, slowly freezing to death while I ignored their pleas for help? The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, muffled sobbing. A woman's voice crying softly but urgently, as if trying to stay quiet while still hoping to be heard. "Please," came the voice, barely audible through the trailer walls. "I know someone's out there. Please help me." I pulled over on the shoulder, hands shaking as I reached for my flashlight. The voice was coming from directly behind my cab, maybe 10 feet back. If I opened the rear trailer doors, I could see what was going on without actually going inside. But as I climbed out of the cab, Cal's voice crackled through my CB radio, except I'd turned it off hours ago. "Ethan, don't do it. Whatever you're thinking, don't fucking do it." I leaned back into the cab and grabbed the mic, even though I knew it wasn't really Cal. "Where are you?" "I opened my trailer," the voice said, and now I could hear the terror underneath the familiar tone. "Jesus Christ, Ethan, I opened it and it was full of them. They look like people, but they're not. There's something else wearing people-like clothes." The sobbing from my trailer grew louder, more desperate. "Please, I have children at home. My baby girl is only 3 years old. Don't listen to it," Cal's voice begged through the radio. "It's in my cab now, sitting right next to me, and it keeps changing faces. First it looked like my ex-girlfriend, then my mother. Now it's wearing my face. Kurt's learning how to be me." I stood in the snow between my cab and trailer, pulled in 2 directions by competing desperations. The logical part of my mind knew that the rules existed for a reason, that every driver who'd broken them had paid a terrible price. But the human part couldn't ignore the sound of genuine terror and pain coming from just a few feet away. "Ethan," Cal's voice again, but different somehow, calmer, more controlled. "I'm okay now." "Everything's fine. You should open your trailer and help whoever's in there." The rules are just superstition. I knew it wasn't Cal anymore. The real Cal was either dead or something worse. And this thing was using his voice to try to manipulate me into making the same mistake he had. The sobbing from the trailer turned into outright screaming, the sound of someone in absolute agony, begging for help that was just inches away. Every human instinct I possessed demanded that I act, that I save this person regardless of the consequences to myself. Instead, I climbed back into my cab, started the engine, and drove. The screaming followed me for miles, growing more frantic with each passing minute. The voice changed, first a woman, then a child, then an elderly man pleading in a language I didn't recognize. Sometimes it was Danny Kowalski, reading from his journal entries. Sometimes it was my own mother, calling my name like she had when I was young and had wandered too far from home. But I kept driving, white-knuckling the steering wheel and focusing on the road ahead. The rules weren't suggestions. They were the accumulated wisdom of every driver who'd survived these roads, written in the blood of those who hadn't. Around mile marker 340, my trailer began to rock violently from side to side, as if something large was throwing itself against the walls. The motion was so severe I thought the whole rig might jackknife, but I maintained speed and tried not to think about what could generate that much force. The rocking continued for 20 minutes, accompanied by sounds that defied description, like metal being torn apart by bare hands, like air being sucked through 2 small spaces, like voices speaking backwards in harmonics that made my teeth ache. Then suddenly, silence. I checked my mirrors and saw something that made my bladder nearly let go. A figure was crawling down the highway behind me, moving with inhuman speed on 2 long limbs. It was pale and thin, wearing the tatters of what might once have been human clothing, and it was gaining on my truck despite my 60-mile-per-hour speed. For a terrifying moment, I thought it would catch me. But as the sun reached its zenith, the figure suddenly veered off the road and disappeared into the tree line, as if the daylight itself was painful to it. I drove for another 100 miles before I felt safe enough to stop. When I finally pulled into a rest area and climbed out to check my trailer, I found deep gouges in the interior walls, scratch marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, if fingernails could be 6 inches long and sharp enough to cut steel, but there was no sign of whatever had made them. The trailer was empty, except for my legitimate cargo, and the doors were still sealed exactly as they'd been when I'd started the run. I stood there in the snow, staring at evidence of something that couldn't exist, and understood that I'd just passed the ultimate test. The things that rode the ice had thrown everything they had at me: fear, guilt, human compassion, manufactured emergency, and I'd refused to break. For now, I was still human. Still myself, still alive. But as I climbed back into my cab and prepared for the final leg of my journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The ice roads had tested me and found me worthy of their attention, and that might be the most terrifying thing of all. The delivery went without incident. Northern Freight Solutions Depot was exactly what I'd expected. A prefab warehouse surrounded by security fencing, staffed by workers who moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd learned not to ask questions. They unloaded my trailer with industrial indifference, checking off items on clipboards and processing paperwork with the bored competence of government bureaucrats. When I asked about Cal Morrison's delivery, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. No record of any driver by that name, the dispatcher said, flipping through his manifest sheets. You're the only Northern Freight run scheduled for this week. But I met him at the Frontier fuel stop. We ran convoy for 2 days. The man's expression didn't change. Maybe he was running for a different company. A lot of freight companies operate up here. I showed him my CB log, the recordings of our conversations, proof that Cal had been real, had been part of this run. But when I played them back, all I heard was static, broken by the occasional sound of my own voice talking to empty air. Every trace of Cal Morrison had been erased as thoroughly, as if he'd never existed. I collected my payment, $3,000 in cash, as promised, and started the long drive back to civilization. But as I passed the various landmarks of my northbound journey, I noticed new additions to my rules packet. Someone had been writing in it while I slept, adding entries in handwriting I didn't recognize. Rule number 12, never look directly at hitchhikers' faces. They remember. Rule number 13, if you hear your own voice on the CB, drive faster. Rule number 14, the things in the mirrors aren't always behind you. Each new rule was followed by initials I didn't recognize. CM, written in shaky block letters, as if by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. Cal Morrison, still trying to help other drivers, even after whatever had happened to him in those woods. I made it back to Whitehorse 3 days later, exhausted and jumping at shadows. The familiar sounds of traffic and civilization should have been comforting, but instead they felt alien and wrong. After days of supernatural silence, broken only by impossible voices, the noise of normal human activity seemed almost offensive. Roy was waiting for me at the way station, looking older than when I'd left. His eyes searched my face as I climbed out of my cab, and whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. You followed the rules, he said. It wasn't a question. Most of them, most is usually enough. The ones who don't make it back, they try to improvise. He looked at my truck, then back at me. Company's got another run for you if you're interested. Same route, same pay. I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. I think I'm done with Northern Freight Solutions. Roy smiled, but it was the kind of smile you'd give someone at a funeral. That's what they all say. Problem is, once you've driven the ice roads, regular freight work feels, he searched for the right word, empty, like you're just going through the motions. I'll manage. Maybe. Or maybe you'll realize that driving the ice is the only time you feel truly alive anymore. The only time the world makes sense, even when it doesn't make sense. He handed me a business card with just a phone number printed on it. When you change your mind, and you will, give me a call. I drove south that afternoon, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the territory. But Roy had been right about one thing. The regular roads felt hollow somehow, like driving through a world made of cardboard. The other drivers I met at truck stops seemed to exist in a different reality, one where the biggest concerns were delivery schedules and fuel costs, rather than survival and sanity. I tried to put the ice roads behind me, but they wouldn't stay buried. I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, expecting to see pale figures crawling along the asphalt. I started carrying Danny Kowalski's journal everywhere, reading his entries like scripture. The rules packet lived in my glove compartment, and I caught myself reciting the rules like a mantra during long, lonely stretches of highway. 3 weeks after returning from the Yukon, I had the dream. I was back on the ice roads, but this time I wasn't alone. Cal was there, sitting in my passenger seat, but he looked wrong. too pale, too still, like a photograph trying to pass for a living person. He was holding the rules packet, reading from it in a voice that echoed strangely in the confines of the cab. "Rule number 15, he said without looking up. "Once you've survived the ice, it never stops calling you back." I woke up in a cold sweat, and when I checked my glove compartment, I found a new entry in my rules packet, written in my own handwriting. Rule number 15. Once you've survived the ice, it never stops calling you back. I had no memory of writing it. A month later, I called the number Roy had given me. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "When do you want to start?" he asked before I could say a word. "Tomorrow," I heard myself say, and realized I'd already made the decision weeks ago. Maybe the moment I'd first seen that hitchhiker's impossible smile. The ice roads had marked me, claimed me, made me part of something larger and more terrible than I could understand. I could spend the rest of my life running regular freight, pretending that the world was a rational, predictable place, or I could accept that some roads only lead in one direction, and that I'd been traveling that direction since the moment I'd first turned north into the endless white expanse of the Yukon territory. The choice wasn't really mine anymore. It never had been. 6 months later, I was back at the way station, watching Roy hand a stapled packet of papers to a young driver I'd never seen before. The kid couldn't have been more than 25. With the kind of eager desperation that comes from being fresh out of trucking school and deep in debt. "Safety instructions," Roy said in the same flat tone he'd used with me. "Read them. Follow them. Don't be creative." The new driver, his paperwork said his name was Marcus Chen, flipped through the packet with the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism I'd shown months earlier. I watched him read the first few rules, saw the moment when skepticism turned to amusement. "Trucker folklore?" he asked, using almost the exact same words I had. Roy's eyes found mine across the parking lot. We shared a look of understanding that went deeper than words. Some conversations had to happen the same way every time, like a ritual that lost its power if you changed the script. "Son," Roy said, "folklore is stories people tell around campfires. These are instructions for staying alive." Marcus laughed, that same dismissive sound that every rookie makes when confronted with something beyond their experience. He climbed into his cab, a well-used Freightliner that had seen better decades, and started his engine. I should have stopped him. Should have pulled him aside and told him about Danny Kowalski, about Cal Morrison, about all the other drivers whose names appeared in the margins of those rules packets. Should have shown him the photographs Mara carried, the faces scratched out by something that didn't want to be remembered. Instead, I watched him drive away into the growing darkness, following the same route I'd taken on my first run, the same route that had changed me in ways I was still discovering. My own truck was parked nearby, engine running, heat blasting against the Arctic cold. I'd just finished my 17th run for Northern Freight Solutions, and I was already planning the 18th. The regular world had become a distant memory, a place I visited between trips, but could never quite inhabit anymore. The ice roads had claimed me completely. I climbed into my cab and checked my updated rules packet, now 37 rules long, accumulated from dozens of drivers over the years. Some were written in my own handwriting, added during moments I couldn't remember. Others appeared overnight, scrawled by hands that might not have been human anymore. The latest addition was at the bottom of the last page, Rule number 37. If you find this packet, follow the rules. They're all that's left of us now. Below it, in handwriting that looked increasingly like my own but somehow wasn't, 4 words that made my blood run cold. Please, follow the rules. I stared at those words for a long time, trying to remember when I'd written them. The memory was there, just out of reach, like trying to recall a dream after waking. But I knew with absolute certainty that whatever part of me had written those words was no longer entirely human. Outside my windshield, the first snowflakes of the evening were beginning to fall, and somewhere ahead of me, Marcus Chen was discovering that the world was a much stranger and more dangerous place than he'd ever imagined. The cycle was beginning again, as it had begun dozens of times before, as it would begin dozens of times in the future. New drivers would come north seeking easy money, would receive their packets of impossible rules, would laugh at the warnings written in other people's blood. Some would learn to follow the rules and become part of the ice road's strange ecology. Others would break the patterns and disappear, leaving behind only scratched-out faces in old photographs and new entries in the margins of safety packets. But all of them would discover the same truth I'd learned. Once you've driven the ice roads, everything else is just marking time between runs. The territory gets into your blood like a virus, changes your brain chemistry, makes normal life feel like a poorly acted play. I started my engine and pulled out onto Highway 5, heading north into the endless white expanse where things that shouldn't exist waited patiently for the next driver, foolish enough to believe that rules were just suggestions. Behind me, in the distance, I could see the glow of Marcus Chen's taillights disappearing around a bend. In a few hours, he'd encounter his first test. Maybe he'd follow the rules and live to see morning. Maybe he'd join the growing list of names in the margins. Either way, the ice roads would have another soul to add to their collection. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, things that wore human faces like masks were already learning to speak in Marcus Chen's voice, preparing for the conversations that would come when he finally understood that some roads only lead in one direction. The direction deeper into the territory, where the rules are written in blood, and the only choice is between following them and becoming something that no longer remembers what it means to be human. I honked twice as I passed mile marker 209, and in the echo that followed, I could have sworn I heard other horns responding from the forest, the voices of every driver who'd ever followed the rules, still trying to warn the ones who came after. But the warnings would go unheeded, as they always did. The ice roads were patient, and there were always more drivers willing to risk everything for easy money and the promise of an adventure. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would, until the ice finally claimed us all.